Hi, my name is dhezelch22, and this is an overview of Chapter 22, the Transoceanic Encounters and Global Connections. So between the 1400s and 1800s, many Europeans had launched many voyages across the ocean in search of valuable goods, such as furs, gold, and different types of agricultural goods. These voyages were funded by European governments and private investors. Both of these parties knew that there could be massive amounts of wealth to be had, because trade routes via the ocean would be more efficient than land-based trade routes. Another motivating factor was the opportunity to spread Christianity around the world. So let's start with the Portuguese and their exploration. The Kingdom of Portugal was very poor, so their motivation to explore the ocean was really more of a necessity. They needed food and gold in order to survive. So they started in the 13th century, which was a lot earlier than most of these other European nations. And they started by trying to find natural resources of food, raw materials, and luxury items. They scoured small islands such as the Canary, Azores, and Madeiras Islands. Apologize about that pronunciation. However, the real goal was to establish a trade route to the Asian markets. This is where the real trading would begin. They wanted to be able to trade silk, spices, porcelain, and other goods. The Portuguese also wanted to trade with Africa. Africa had many sought-after goods, such as gold, ivory, and slaves. Natural resources were not the only priority of the Portuguese. They also wanted to spread Christianity. This would become more efficient if they had sea-based routes in which to send their missionaries. The man behind all of the voyages was Prince Henry the Navigator. He encouraged and funded many of these operations. So the technology of the time was very important. Without proper technology, none of these voyages could have been feasible. Advancements on the ship, such as the rudder, which was a Chinese invention that had made its way up to Portugal, had allowed ships to become more maneuverable in rough waters and in waters in general. Navigational instruments were also very important to these voyages. If they couldn't determine where they were going or where they were at, they almost certainly would have not gotten to the desired location. The magnetic compass was also another Chinese invention. It's a compass, so it allowed the user to determine which way was north. Excuse me. The astrolabe was another important device that allowed the user to determine his latitude. Also, understanding how the wind and ocean currents operated was also crucial to being able to get to the desired location. Since both of these, right. So, Prince Henry of Portugal had contributed a significant part to the explorations. He and his men set up camps at Salo Jorge da Mina. This was a strategic location he claimed in order to sail down the coast of Africa. There he traded horses and other goods for gold and slaves. Henry eventually died in 1488, but the voyages still continued. Vasco da Gama was also Portuguese, and in 1497 he left Lisbon and went to India. He brought back spices, as these were highly sought after products. Christopher Columbus had proposed a western trade route to Asia. Instead of going south and around Africa, instead of Portugal, Columbus sailed from Spain, funded by Italian investors. When Columbus had arrived at what he thought was India, he actually arrived at what is now known as the Americas. When he returned, he reported to the king and queen that he had indeed found a western trade route to India, but in fact he actually discovered a new continent, North America. He never actually reached Asia, but people had heard about the discovery of his new continent, and people from many different countries started to prepare a voyage to the new land. Ferdinand Magellan, also another famous explorer, sailed for the Portuguese and had traveled east beyond the Americas. He, like Columbus, wanted to establish a western trade route to the Asian markets. However, Portugal did not want to find a western trade route. Instead, the Spanish wanted to find this route, and from then on, Magellan sailed for Spain. Magellan's goal was to find a strait in South Africa that would lead him to the Pacific Ocean. In doing so, he was the very first person to circumnavigate the globe. However, conditions were not easy. They eventually ran out of food, and they had to eat ox hides that had been softened by dragging them in the water. Scurvy was also a major issue. It had killed 29 members of Magellan's crew during this voyage. And last, James Cook, a very important explorer in the series of explorations. Cook had sailed through the Pacific Ocean and had mapped the eastern side of Australia and New Zealand. So, trade and conflict in early modern Asia. The voyages I talked about earlier had given vast amount of knowledge to the Europeans. This allowed them to sail almost anywhere and return safely. These Europeans had constructed trading posts at strategic locations in order to give them an advantage when trading. At times they even tried to control the spice trade, but they eventually failed at this quest. Portuguese trading routes were built the earliest in terms of sea exploration, like we mentioned earlier. And Vasco da Gama had established a trading post at Calicut when he arrived there in 1498. The Portuguese did not want to conquer territories, but they wanted to control the spice trade. This would, in effect, give them more profit. Like I mentioned earlier, since these were the earliest trading posts to be constructed, they also had the advantage because of this. Alfonso de Albuquerque. I apologize again about the pronunciation, but he was the commander of the Portuguese forces in the Indian Ocean in the 16th century. During this time, Alfonso had seized Hormuz and Gowa and Malacca, which allowed them to control the trade more efficiently. He wanted to have total control over the Indian Ocean in order to control these trade routes. He would give safe passage to anyone who paid them, basically, like I mentioned earlier. He even bragged about how large the Portuguese navy was, although, as it turns out, the Portuguese navy was really not as large as he made it out to seem. Arab vessels had been able to sail through the Red Sea, an area the Portuguese were never able to control. By the late 16th century, the Portuguese navy had weakened to a point where they were no longer a threat to other countries' trade. English and Dutch merchants had a different way of controlling trade. They built their trading posts on Asian coasts so they did not have to sail the high seas in order to control their trade. They also had two other main advantages. They sailed ships that were cheaper, faster, and more powerful than Portuguese ships. And this allowed them to have a militaristic advantage over the Portuguese, whose ships were slower and more expensive. These two countries made two powerful trading companies, the East India Trading Company and the VOC. East India Company was the English Trading Company, and the VOC, which I will not even try to pronounce, the non-abbreviated version of, was the Dutch's Trading Company. These companies were able to provide more money and more power than their governments could. And they were able to increase profits for their investors, particularly the East India Trading Company. Once the Dutch had seen the profits that they were making, they decided to form their own, which is the VOC. During this time of massive exploration, the Europeans had begun conquering many different lands and indigenous people. They had started to establish colonies. They were, however, unable to exert their power over some of these Asian countries because some of these Asian countries were more developed than they had thought. This was true for most of Asia except for the Philippines and Indonesia. These two countries were not very powerful, so it did not take much for the Europeans to establish dominance. Spanish forces had entered the Philippines in 1565 and had taken over the government with very little bloodshed. There was no real central government in the Philippines, so there really wasn't an organized resistance to this Spanish invasion. The city of Manila soon became a hub for trade and Christianity in the Philippines. There are also large numbers of Chinese in the Manila, almost 1/4 of the population. Silk was the main commodity that was traded in Manila, and the success of the Chinese also brought along resentment, and the Philippines, the native indigenous people, ended up killing about tens of thousands of Chinese in several different events over about 200 or 300 years. On the Dutch side of trading in Indonesia, the main focus was not religion, but it was trade, spices in particular. Java was an island in Batavia. Apologize again about the pronunciation. And that had served as a trading port for the Dutch. They used their naval power to control basically all of the trading and eventually monopolized that island. In northeastern Eurasia, the Russians had begun conquering and seizing trade. This was in Siberia, a frozen, densely wooded area. Their primary trade was furs, a luxury item. During this time of exploration in Siberia, Russia had encountered many different indigenous people. These people were very diverse. About 26 different ethnic groups were in Siberia at the time. These people had already been hunting and gathering furs for themselves. The Russians had also tried to convert these people to Christianity. However, this was ineffective because the native people simply didn't want to convert. So rivalries between the different countries for the control of these trade routes had started the 7 Years' War. This war was between Britain and Prussia against France, Austria, and Russia. Sorry about that. The Spanish had also joined the French in order to stop the expansion of the English. In North America, a conflict had already began happening, the French and Indian War, and these two conflicts essentially merged and became the same conflict. The Prussians had their land secured in Europe, but the British had a very advanced military and it was easily able to conquer most foes on the seas. Although in land there was not much fighting between the Prussians and the British. So ecological exchanges. During this time, the Europeans had established trade routes to all places on the globe. This means there was a vast amount of trade going on. This type of trade included food, spices, and lots of other goods. Along this, along with this trading came diseases. Prior to this, there were not many routes connecting all these places, so the transfer of goods was not feasible. Therefore, the transfer of diseases was far less, if any at all. Along with the transfer of these goods came the transfer of, well, diseases. Because some populations had never been exposed to these diseases before and not built up an immunity, it ended up killing massive amounts of people. Some of the most deadly diseases being smallpox, measles, whooping cough, and malaria. These diseases affected the indigenous people of the Americas the worst because, well, the Eastern Hemisphere really didn't know of the Americas' existence up until Christopher Columbus found it. These diseases had a significant effect on the population. For example, the indigenous population of Mexico had declined about 90% at that time, and the Spanish conquerors had established dominance, and the traditions these indigenous people had were now lost. Although these diseases caused massive amounts of devastation, the population started to increase rather than decrease. This was because, well, with trading, people didn't just trade gold, they traded food. And a lot of these places only had a certain amount or diversity of food. Their food was their diversity of food was very narrow. So when they started getting all of these new foods, such as wheat, rice, sugar, and bananas, they were able to grow a lot more diverse and healthy food that allowed them to be more nutritious and essentially survive a lot longer. These American crops played a very big role in European agriculture. Corn, potatoes, and beans are just some of the few foods that took root in European societies. For example, Ireland relied heavily on potatoes after they were brought over. And this is what allowed the population to increase exponentially because of this nutritious food. These foods were also easier to grow in mass than their current foods, so a lot less people were starving and dying. But food wasn't the only thing to move across regions. People from different countries were migrating in order to find a better life, or because they were forced to. And during this time, trade between oceans was exploding. There was a massive amount of it. It wasn't just food and spices anymore, but it was guns, technology, people, etc. From Mexican mines and American tobacco to European textiles and guns. There wasn't anything that wasn't being traded. The trading had a variety of effects on the market and the environment. For example, silver and furs were becoming a lot more desirable, so more mines were being dug and more animals were being caught and skinned. An example of this was the American beaver. I believe it was about 16 million beavers at one time were being skinned for their furs. And during the next 2 centuries, trading would increase and the general wealth of the population would also increase. And that's my presentation. Thank you for listening.